the name of a dance we do down Johannesburg way. And everybody starts to move as soon as Pata Pata starts to play.
Sometimes alone in the evening, I look outside my window at the shadows in the night. I hear the sound of distant crying, the darkness multiplying, and weary hearts deny. All I feel is my heartbeat, beating like a drum, beating with confusion. All I hear are the voices telling me to go, but I could never run, because in my African
It's generally accepted that Judaism is very much a community religion, with association through groups such as the extended family unit or the religious quorum for communal prayer. The initial Jewish settlers and adventurers who came to the Cape Colony may have been lone travelers, but once they were established, they reached out to their fellow co-religionists for fellowship, work association, and more. The first minyanim were always held in someone's home, Judaism not being prescriptive of the necessity of a designated synagogue for prayer. However, it took 8 years from the first official Yom Kippur service in Benjamin Norden's home in Cape Town to the opening of the first community synagogue, which stood on the corner of Bouquet and St. John's Streets. No longer extant, it fell not to progress and building development, but to abandonment by that early congregation, since that adapted house had not been maintained. This is the Tikvat Israel Shul in the Company Gardens, the first purpose-built synagogue in South Africa that replaced that earlier one. The Jews of South Africa had their first physical presence.
In actual fact, the first physical presence was not a building as such and not concerned with the vibrant lives of the community, but with the dead. The oldest document of Jewish origin here is a petition dated October 1838, signed by 5 Jews living in the Grahamstown area, asking for some ground to be used as a cemetery.
The order of priority appeared to be a cemetery followed by a shul, but the synagogue depended on the size of the community. In the smaller country towns, even if they could muster a minyan, the preference was for a room in someone's home that served the purpose. These shtiblach were discreet and functional and helped give these tiny Jewish communities a communal center without intruding into the community at large until there was a sense of acceptance and welcome.
They came to South Africa. What did they come to? They had no idea what they came to, but they knew that either they had a family member or they heard that there was prosperity in Africa and they were coming to that. But you need to think and understand and imagine people came mainly from Eastern Europe, etc. Cold weather, not used to the heat of Africa, arrived in South Africa. First of all, no language. They spoke Yiddish, German, or wherever they came from. The climate was horrendous for them. They were totally not used to it. Something as well, they had never seen black people before. All of a sudden they arrived and there were black people. They weren't told before what to expect. They came to absolutely mystery, but they had this incredible will and desire, which most people do throughout history, and that's why we have survived, to make it happen and to survive.
The old joke has it that if a Jew was shipwrecked on a desert island, he would build 2 shuls, one to attend, one he wouldn't be seen dead in. There were certainly rifts and schisms within South African Jewry, and in a number of instances, fairly small communities supported 2 synagogues in the country towns. The most famous of them are the 2 synagogues of Oudtshoorn. The first, known as the English Shul, which is this one, was established in 1888. One of the stories told indicates the degree to which the Jewish community had been accepted by the Afrikaner community, which was pleased to have the people of the book in its midst, but were disconcerted that they had no visible church or kerk. Services had been held in various homes and within the Feather Market Hall. To encourage the building of a synagogue, land was donated by one of the Afrikaner townsfolk and the stone and bricks by another, and the synagogue was duly constructed with the aid of subscriptions and contributions from the Jewish community and was consecrated. However, the style of worship was modeled on the English tradition, hence the name, which was a more restrained form of ritual observance. In addition, the Englische Schule provided no study groups or shiurim or fulfilled an educative role, something that was deeply desired by the Litvak immigrants who were beginning to arrive and would form such an important part of the Otsu and feather industry. The Litvak style of worship, with its more vocal, more emotional display, caused a rift with the earlier Anglo-German community and a legendary clash between the incumbent Reverend Wolfson, even the nomenclature was anglicized, Reverend, and a Litvak congregant who insisted on singing along to the Shabbat Torah reading, led to the Litvaks breaking away and forming their own congregation. Back in Cape Town, it seems that rifts and schisms bedeviled that community from the very beginning. The first rabbi appointed to the Tikvat Israel congregation by the chief rabbi of Great Britain, one Reverend Isaac Pulver, resigned his position after only 2 years in Cape Town. One of the reasons he gave was a lack of orthodoxy in the community. Another was the split that already existed amongst the congregants in relation to a long list of community issues, including the use of congregation funds.
It took 8 years before the Reverend Joel Rabinowitz arrived as a replacement in 1859. And one of the first things he did was to organize the funding of a new place of worship, the Tikvat Israel Synagogue in Cape Town's Company Garden, still standing, although it is now part of the National Jewish Museum. And its subsequent grander and ornate replacement stands immediately alongside the Garden Synagogue. With the arrival of this second wave of immigrants, the Litvaks, the number of synagogues in Cape Town multiplied dramatically. Many of these immigrants sought a recreation of the more modest houses of learning that they knew from the Alter Heim. Not feeling welcome in the Anglophile synagogues, the East European immigrants built their own. And it's interesting to note that the first of these shuls in all the cities and larger towns of South Africa inevitably had the nickname of the Grüne Schul, Grüne being the epithet applied to the greenhorn new immigrants. A similar pattern can be discerned in Johannesburg. The first Rosh Hashanah service took place in a partially completed building in Market Street that was destined to become a shop on the 20th of September 1886, a few weeks before the mining camp was proclaimed a township. By 1889, the Witwatersrand Hebrew congregation would consecrate the first purpose-built synagogue in Johannesburg on President Street. Yet the same split between the Anglo Jewry and the Eastern European brethren resulted in the Litvaks hiving off in 1891 to form the Johannesburg Hebrew congregation and building their own synagogue on the corner of De Villiers and Joubert Street. The nearby Kruger Park, later to become the first Wanderers Club, gave the new shul its name of Park Synagogue. 2 years later, an even more Lithuanian-style congregation established itself in the Fox Street Orthodox Hebrew congregation, and its synagogue became known as the Grüne Schul for Johannesburg. The rifts and schisms don't end there, and in quick succession came the Ponevitzer Chevra and the Fordsburg Minyan.
In a very short space of time, the Johannesburg Jewish community had established itself as being just like any fractious, quarrelsome Jewish community around the world. But more importantly, it does indicate just how quickly the Jewish population of Johannesburg had grown that it could support so many disparate congregations.
Reform Judaism originated in Germany in the late 19th century. Considering that the first wave of Jewish immigration into South Africa had a significant and notable German component, it is surprising that the reform movement only established itself here in 1933. There had been brief flickers and interest shown by certain individuals, and certainly some of the early refugees from Nazi Germany had identified with reform congregations there, but it was only with the arrival of Rabbi M.C. Wheeler that the progressive congregation was formally established. Their first Rosh Hashanah service was held in a Freemason hall in Johannesburg, since the Orthodox community refused the use of any of their facilities. The Reform community has always formed a smaller percentage of South African Jewry, with representation only in the larger cities. The conservative movement, sometimes called Masorti, which means traditional, has barely had a presence here, with a single congregation in existence. The relationship between Orthodoxy and the progressive congregations has been frosty at best, and often extremely bitter, though there was a brief attempt at a concordat between Chief Rabbi Bernard Casper and Senior Reform Rabbi Arthur Super in the mid-60s.
For most of its existence, the majority of South African Jewry has identified with what has been termed non-observing orthodoxy, with synagogue attendance limited to the high holy days and Passover, and the occasional Shabbat service, usually precipitated by a family bar mitzvah or wedding. In fact, some observances took on a distinctly South African individuality, with many families keeping a kosher home, but eating out at non-kosher restaurants or driving to the synagogue on the Sabbath or festivals. The first half of the Jewish community's history in South Africa appears more flexible in observance than it is today, with dwindling numbers and a more rigid adherence to Orthodox traditions. Yet, as I've already mentioned, there was no unified community response to certain issues, since each synagogue, shul, or shtibel had its own adherents, and the gulf between one small community and another was often yawning. Certain events at the turn of the century needed a unified response.
The continued absorption of Litvak immigrants leaving Eastern Europe was one issue that had to be addressed, particularly once the Anglo-Boer War came to an end. A combination of rising anti-Semitism, the necessity of repatriating to the Transvaal the Jewish immigrants who had left because of the war, and the passing of the Cape Immigration Restriction Act of 1902, which disallowed Yiddish-speaking immigrants and all those who could not speak or write a European language, made it apparent that a representative body that could speak for the community as a whole was needed. The fact that the 4 colonies had not yet become the Union of South Africa and had their own administrations meant that the representation was going to be piecemeal and localized. First came the Jewish Board of Deputies for the Transvaal, after a meeting in Johannesburg of representatives of the South African Zionist Federations, the Witwatersrand Helping Hand and Burial Society, the Witwatersrand Old Hebrew Congregation, and many more allied institutions. That was in April 1903. A similar meeting of such institutions in Natal a few weeks later asked for membership, and the name of the Board of Deputies was amended to include that colony. More than a year later, and after a challenge to the Jewish establishment by younger, more radical members of the community who were unpersuaded by the conservative, quieter approach of the leadership, the Jewish Board of Deputies of the Cape Colony was established. Both boards took as their model the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Even though the unification of the colonies was achieved in 1910, it took a further 2 years before the South African Board of Deputies unified the various representatives at a conference held in Bloemfontein.
The unification into a single representative body was very nearly derailed by disagreement over where the executive would be based. The biggest Jewish community was in the Transvaal, but the Cape representatives were only mollified when 4 provincial committees were proposed in addition to the Johannesburg-based executive. Fractious, individualistic, and schismatic, like any Jewish community everywhere.
The second wave of immigration, the Litvak arrivals, formed small community groups almost immediately. These Landsmannschaften, or immigrant benevolence societies, were usually named for the town, shtetl, or district from which the members had come. Like associated with like, and most immigrants tended to gravitate to where family members or neighbors had gone before, making such supportive societies possible. In addition, in the absence of a centralized community Chevra Kadisha or burial society, which only came later, many of these Landsmannschaften performed that function, including tahara or purification before burial and enshrouding. In most Jewish communities around the world, the Chevra Kadisha is concerned only with burial and its allied services first and foremost. In South Africa, however, a wider social and charitable role was allied to those activities from the very start, making this society unique. On its foundation in Johannesburg in 1888, it was known in English as the Jewish Helping Hand and Burial Society. It also then incorporated an existing organization called Bikur Cholim, which means visiting the sick, which was their primary function. The reason for them predating the Chevra Kadisha is that there were more demands for that service, only 7 Jewish deaths having been recorded until then in the mining camp that became Johannesburg. A German Jewish immigrant called Max Raffaeli was the first president of the Chevra Kadisha, and one of his principal functions prior to the accumulation of funds through subscription and donation entailed his collecting charitable donations from door to door to pay for the funerals of the poor. A mortuary and ohel, gathering hall, the word is actually Hebrew for tent, was constructed at the cemetery, partly paid for by members of the committee, and much-needed welfare work among the needy was started. In addition, the society assisted in medical expenses, acquiring the services of sympathetic doctors and chemists, and sought employment for those who needed it, sometimes even providing trade tools or a smoker's cart, for example. In these ways, the South African Chevra Kadisha was unique, and though the methods are translated into more modern approaches, it is part of the truly comprehensive services the Chev, as it is affectionately known, still provides to the South African Jewish community.
10 years after its founding, the Chevra Kadisha was drawn into the escalating problem of Jewish pimping and prostitution on the Witwatersrand. Remember the Peruvniks? And they formed a vigilance committee charging one of the Bet Din Dayanim, or judges, with researching interpretations of Jewish law or halakha on the matter. In some cases, rehabilitation was achieved, particularly with those who had been falsely lured to South Africa with the promise of a good job as a seamstress or shop assistant. In other cases, the Chev was less successful, and the rabbi's solution was a cordoned-off special section of the cemetery called, in Yiddish, der Hock, when their time came.
The Bikur Cholim broke away from the Chevra Kadisha over the issue of a Jewish hospital and developed a small convalescent ward into a 30-bed unit. Sadly, it was for males only, but proved necessary since the Johannesburg hospital had no doctors or nurses who could speak Yiddish. By 1897, the Jewish hospital ceased to function, and the Chevra Kadisha went into negotiation with the Johannesburg hospital over a number of issues, the most important being the building of a Jewish mortuary in the hospital. The Anglo-Boer War brought a halt to most of the activities of the Chevra Kadisha, and it turned its attention to war relief efforts. One of the most notable and necessary was the formation of a volunteer Jewish ambulance corps, which served with distinction. And once Lord Roberts occupied Johannesburg with the British forces, they served the military authorities accordingly.
The care of the aged was something that particularly concerned the nascent Jewish community of South Africa. The first Jewish aged home was founded in Johannesburg in 1912 in a substantially sized house in Joubert Park. An impressively bosomed and iron-willed Mrs. Gluckman was the first matron appointed to manage the home under the direction of a women's committee, which was in turn under the supervision of the then president of the Chevra Kadisha, Mr. Raphael Alexander. There were problems that manifested themselves early on, including quarreling, spitting in the corridors, and the intrusion of male residents into the female ward, as well as an apparent clash between residents and the matron over her strict rule. Eventually, Mrs. Gluckman gathered her corsets and departed, but lodged as her main complaint the unwarranted kibitzing on the part of certain members of the committee.
The need to accommodate increasing numbers of the community necessitated a move for the Jewish aged home, and its next location was the first home of landlord Sir George Albu in Doornfontein. This impressively large structure was known as the Turrets, but the exponential growth of the aged Jewish population over the next 3 decades required a comprehensive building program that added to the original house until the additions dwarfed the residence. Soon after the Second World War, the Chevra Kadisha purchased a substantial piece of ground in the new suburb of Sandringham that was being developed for returning ex-soldiers. Today, it's known as Sandringham Gardens, and a much more recent retirement village called Golden Acres has been built alongside. Today, there are a number of homes for the elderly around the country. In addition to Sandringham Gardens, there is Our Parents' Home, founded by refugees from Nazi Germany in 1940 and intended originally for the German Jewish community, but now open to any Jew regardless of family origin. And Beit Shalom on the Berea in Durban. An umbrella organization uniting all the various service, welfare and charity organizations, similar to the Chevra Kadisha, only came about in 1955. It was called the Durban Jewish Welfare Association.
Cape Town maintained its independence. The mourning rites and rituals of burial were administered by each individual synagogue, but a welfare organization had been set up in 1859 called the Cape Town Jewish Philanthropical Society. Its original purpose was, as its minute book curiously states, to assist stranded and shipwrecked sailors and passengers and impecunious widows, all presumably Jews. The needs of the burgeoning community soon changed the focus into more general welfare and philanthropic work, and the committee was supervised by the Reverend Alfred Bender. Many of the practical duties and relief work were assumed by the Ladies' Association of the Garden Synagogue, something Bender had initiated. Eventually, later organizations such as the Bikur Cholim and one of the first of the Landsmannschaft organizations, the Ponowitzer Sick Benefit Society, were asked to join. The organization transmuted into the Cape Jewish Board of Guardians. It still exists, like the Witwatersrand Chevra Kadisha, but changed its name again in 1998 to Cape Jewish Communal Services. The home for the Jewish aged in Cape Town was established by the Cape Town Jewish Philanthropical Society at the start of the 20th century in a rambling house in the city. Now called Highlands House, it was relocated to a purpose-built complex with similar facilities to Sandringham Gardens in Johannesburg. It's an indication of the fragility of life in the early decades of the Jewish community in South Africa that the first orphanage preceded the founding of an old-aged home.
The tenuous mortality wasn't confined to the adult Jewish population, as the number of infant graves in the old Braamfontein cemetery attests. But in the aftermath of the Anglo-Boer War, the number of children who had lost one or both parents was sufficient to alarm Rabbi Dr. J.H. Hertz, who had been appointed to the Witwatersrand Old Hebrew Congregation in 1898. The efforts to found a Jewish orphanage were greatly assisted by the donation of land and a seed amount for the building fund by the chairman of the newly instituted Jewish Board of Deputies, Max Langerman. After some squabbling and jockeying for position amongst the women of the Jewish Ladies' Communal Guild, a committee was eventually formed. A house in Hillbrow was rented, and the first children were accommodated. And the purpose-built home in Kensington was opened in October 1905.
One of the stories told about the orphanage in its early days concerned a widower, a Mr. Earlstein, who had placed his children with the home since he was unable to care for them by himself. He was, however, expected to pay for their maintenance, but soon proved delinquent in his payments, despite repeated requests from the committee. Mrs. Goldstein, a widow, had also placed her children in the care of the orphanage. You can imagine the outrage when it was discovered that Mr. Earlstein and Mrs. Goldstein had married and had abandoned their children to the kindness of the community. The erring newlyweds were forced to retrieve their now extensive combined family and resume responsibility for their care. By 1921, need had already outstripped the number of places that the building could provide, largely because of a group of Jewish children who had been orphaned in Europe during the First World War and had been sent to Johannesburg. When the mansion of landlord Sir Lionel Phillips, called Villa Arcadia, came up for sale, the committee abandoned plans for new construction and relocated to the decidedly grander surrounds of Parktown Ridge, with its superb view across the developing northern Johannesburg suburbs. And that's how the South African Jewish Children's Orphanage became known as Arcadia Jewish Children's Home, abbreviated by the residents to the ARC. Today, the ARC is located in modern, more Hamish surrounds alongside the vast complex in eastern Johannesburg that houses most of the welfare organizations and services of the Johannesburg Jewish community.
A similar narrative attends the Cape Town community. There, the initiator was the redoubtable Reverend Alfred Bender of the Cape Town Hebrew congregation, who, in similar manner to Rabbi J.H. Hertz, enlisted the aid of the Ladies' Association of his synagogue to get things going. The orphanage opened in Mill Street in Cape Town in a converted residence in 1911, but later moved further up the hill to Oranjezicht, under the stewardship of its founder, Mr. Isaac Ochberg. His name is attached to one of the most stirring and moving stories of the South African Jewish community. The Jews of the second wave of immigration into South Africa maintained strong links with the Alte Heim, the old country. And though it took a while, news of what occurred there eventually made its way to the community in Africa. The civil warfare between opposing sides in the wake of the Russian Revolution and the aftermath of the First World War had affected the area of Eastern Europe from which most of South African Jewry is derived, and particularly the Ukraine. In addition to the Civil War, pogroms and the influenza epidemic had left many Jewish children orphaned and destitute. Isaac Ochberg determined to rescue as many of these children as he could and bring them to South Africa. He initiated a fund the Pogrom Orphan Fund to pay the costs and lobbied Prime Minister Jan Smuts for permission.
Permission which was granted, though there was a long list of conditions attached regarding which children were deemed suitable, and further, that the South African Jewish community would bear sole responsibility for the care and education of the children once in South Africa. Ochberg set sail for London, and from there, under very difficult conditions, because the Civil War was still being waged, to Eastern Europe, where he had the heartbreaking duty of selecting which children would return with him. Some of them balked at the idea, terrified by the wild and savage continent of Africa. However, nearly 200 children accompanied Ochberg on the voyage home and were placed both at the Oranjezicht home and here at Arcadia in Johannesburg.
Over the decades, as specialized need arose, the Jewish community has created an extraordinary number of welfare services. Some of them are more than a century old, others are recent additions to the achievements of this community. The Selwyn Siegel Home in Johannesburg, Jewel House in Durban, and Glendale in Cape Town provide for the intellectually disabled. Bikur Cholim still exists, well over a century since its founding. And there are organizations that provide sheltered employment, health services, trauma counseling, addiction rehabilitation, and kosher meals on wheels.
In this way, the South African Jewish community reflects many Jewish communities elsewhere, but the significance comes with the realization that the community is actually far smaller and with lesser resources than most of the international communities, for whom these welfare services are an expected part of the community's existence. It's almost a truism to say that education has always been one of the pillars of Judaism and is even mentioned in the Shema prayer as a parental duty. Although much of the education could be conducted within the family home and was centered on the transmission of a cultural heritage, for boys there was always the progression to a Talmud Torah attached to the local synagogue.
The ever-industrious Rabbi Joel Rabinowitz of the Cape Town Hebrew congregation instituted the first formal classes for Hebrew and religious instruction at the Tikvat Israel Synagogue in 1868. The next congregation to follow suit was in Port Elizabeth, and then Durban, all strongly within the Anglo-German immigrant approach. In Cape Town, in particular, the model was very much that of the London Jewish congregations, seeking to unite some Victorian educational principles with traditional Jewish methods. The experience of the Litvak immigrants was one where religious education was of paramount importance, and every shul had a cheder, literally a room, for juvenile education, and an area set aside for adult learning. No matter how straitened their circumstances of origin were, these new immigrants expected to institute those educational traditions in their new homeland. And since the majority of the Litvaks found themselves in the Transvaal and the new city of Johannesburg, that is where the first purpose-built Jewish schools could be found. The first effort was a small day school offering primary education in a corrugated iron and wooden structure built for the purpose in the grounds of the Witwatersrand Hebrew congregation. A Hebrew educational board was instituted, and the school opened its doors in 1890. When the split in the congregation came, the school continued as the traditional Talmud Torah that it was, albeit providing rudimentary secular education, but moves were made to form a jointly administered school that could provide a general standardized curriculum in addition to Jewish studies. The co-educational Jewish school, situated on a stand next to the Park Synagogue and with a capacity enrollment of 161 pupils, opened its doors in 1897. In Cape Town, the Hope Mill School in Gardens opened a year earlier with an imported English headmaster. The Hope Mill School became a significant part of the Cape Town educational network because of the excellence of its teaching, and eventually non-Jewish pupils were admitted and the school lost its Jewish identity. When the British occupied Johannesburg in the Anglo-Boer War, the Jewish school building was commandeered as a military hospital, but after it was returned to the community, it languished until it was taken over by the Transvaal administration and reopened as the non-fee-paying Jewish government school. For the next 3 decades, most of South African Jewry sought their children's education at government schools across the Union, or, once again, the wealthy would pay the fees for private schools.
In fact, that was thought of as extremely desirable for the upwardly mobile community, who stressed the cachet of private education in allowing their children access to a better social stratum. Hebrew and traditional Jewish education was confined to Cheder instruction at the various synagogues across the country, and it was generally terminated once the pupils had achieved bar mitzvah status. As usual, girls received the short end of the stick and received rudimentary Jewish instruction from their grandmothers or mothers, if at all.
In the aftermath of the Second World War and the revelation of the enormity of the Holocaust, there was a revival of interest in the provision of a secular Jewish education amongst some of the community. There was just as much opposition, if not more, from those who felt that assimilation and integration were the better routes to allow the Jewish community to be subsumed into the general white community. Exceptionalism and individuality would draw unwanted attention.
So I think it was a very controversial decision. Many people felt that we should have left, we were so persecuted in the time of the Holocaust that we should leave that behind us. But there were 3 visionaries who felt very strongly that we needed a Jewish school if we were going to preserve our Judaism. We had fought, we had died in the Holocaust, and they wanted to preserve that Jewish education. And those 3 visionaries were Louis Sachs, Yossi Yellen, and Isaac Goss, of course. And they were they walked around and really motivated the community to try and build this Jewish day school, and came under enormous pressure and resistance in those times. That was always paramount, that we should offer a Jewish education of excellence as well as a secular education of excellence. Both were equally important. Well, I'd like to believe that that always held, that, it wasn't enough to just be a good school. We had to be an excellent Jewish school. Our whole reason for being was to be able to, dor le dor, create that generation to generation, that love of Yiddishkeit, that love of Israel. That was very much instilled in the ethos of our school, and that is passed down from generation to generation. There are 3 campuses within the King David schools today. There's a Linksfield campus, which is the biggest. We then have a Victory Park campus, and we have a Sandton campus. And today those campuses house over 3,300 children. So we've got one of the biggest Jewish day school networks in the world.
The same factionalism that attended the first attempts to provide a Jewish education has re-emerged more recently with a proliferation of smaller schools administered by the more strictly Orthodox communities who insist on single-sex education a greater emphasis on a dominance of Jewish studies over secular, and adherence to sectarian traditions and beliefs. Hence the current popularity of schools such as the Torah Academy, Beis Yaakov, and Hirsch Lyons. The South African Jewish community had an assured sense of its own identity, but for a long time struggled to integrate fully into the surrounding society. Take, as an example, one which was an understandable reaction to a pervasive form of anti-Semitism that existed within a specific social context.
While the younger second and third generation Jews in a sports-mad country could find recreational activity within the context of the sports fields of the Jewish day schools, their parents were increasingly excluded from many of the country clubs that proliferated for upper middle-class white society. The Jewish reaction was to create their own, and the major cities boasted at least one, if not two.
We cannot say that they were responsible for the high-achieving Jewish sportsmen in the country who would have done so anyway, but they were extremely supportive.
I think it started after the Second World War. My late father-in-law, Tutsi Tiga, was one of the pioneers in forming the Balfour Park Sports Club. In essence, it was for Jewish sportsmen, but it changed quite significantly when I started to play cricket there in the late 50s. Certainly in our cricket team, there were a lot of Gentiles in our cricket team. But from that club, the sport was for the Jewish people in the Joburg area every weekend. And the cricket team played Premier League. The soccer team was in the Premier League. The bowls teams in the Premier League. It was a very high standard of sporting excellence. And from that fantastic setup, many of our great sportsmen emerged and eventually went on to play for South Africa. Unfortunately, that club does not exist anymore. It ran into financial problems and eventually was sold. And I think one of the reasons why we don't have prominent Jews in South African sport today is the absence of a Balfour Park club, whether it be in Johannesburg or Cape Town or Durban. So it's a very sad philosophy that I'm expanding to, but it is a fact. Balfour Park was a cornerstone of the success of South African sporting Jewry, starting after the Second World War and reaching a peak in the 60s and 70s.
Well, you've got to tell us the story of the rugby minion.
Well, it's quite extraordinary. From 1931, Morris Zimmerman was the first Jew to play for the Springbok team. And right through till the late 60s, there were 10 Jewish Springboks, but not only did they play for our country, but they excelled. They were prominent in the success of the Springbok rugby teams. And the late Donnie Craven, I mean, it's common knowledge at the time, he said, look, I need a Jew in my Springbok team. And they excelled to the extent that in 1949, we played the All Blacks here, and the first test match was at Ellis Park. And the late Oki Geffen won the match on his own. 5 converted penalties, and we beat the All Blacks. And he continued to have great success throughout that series. Wolf Rosenberg, late Wolf Rosenberg, just died recently in Israel, the mid-50s. Fantastic rugby player, came from Potchefstroom, went to Jeppe High School. Crash tackler, known for his tackling, great rugby player. Joe Kamler played for South Africa. Alan Mentor, we were at medical school today. Fly half, he played for Pretoria University and then the Springboks. So it was part of the Springbok culture that you had to have a South African Jew in that rugby team.
One of the notable hallmarks of the Jewish community of South Africa has been the strength and singularity of its Zionist identity. Zionism, which developed in the 19th century alongside other European notions of rebirth, was notably popular in the Pale of Settlement, and in particular in Lithuania. The two main oppositions to Zionist ideals, the Bundists, who adhered to the emergent socialist principles that would subsequently initiate the Bolshevik Revolution, and the diametrically antipathetic Agudas Yisrael religious conservatives would also travel with the Litvak immigrants to South Africa. But the community, once established in South Africa, overwhelmingly embraced the Zionist movement. A Chovevei Tzion society, Lovers of Zion, was established here well before the existence of a Jewish Board of Deputies, as was the Zionist Federation, which, until the institution of the board, did some negotiation with the government authorities on behalf of the whole community over immigration restrictions. The South African Zionist Federation was established in 1898, and in the course of its subsequent development proved itself unique in comparison to other Zionist federations internationally. First was its successful and continuous fundraising for the Zionist cause. Before the establishment of the State of Israel, South African Jews were, per capita, the largest donors in the world. Second was the early involvement and prominence of women and women's groups. Amongst their many achievements was the permanent presence of the JNF Blue Box in nearly every home across the country, so ubiquitous that it hardly seems worth commenting on. The Women's Zionist Council was established in 1932 and was incorporated into the Federation by 1939. Third was the equivalently high level of youth involvement. Young Israel societies proliferated across the country, along with the Judean societies in the Cape. By 1927, there was a Young Israel Federation, and 5 years later, a Zionist Youth Council fell under the umbrella of the Zionist Fed. Next came the incorporation of the various political ideologies. By the 30s, there was representation across the ideological spectrum from left to right, including Poale Zion, labor Zionism, religious Zionism, and anti-socialist revisionism.
By the time the revisionist leader Zeev Jabotinsky began visiting South Africa in an effort to drum up financial support from the community, in addition to spreading his ideology, the Jiddische Arbeiters Club, or Jewish Workers' Club, engaged in furious street brawls with young revisionists and provided the citizens of Johannesburg with a new spectacle played out on the steps of the City Hall and in front of the Plaza Cinema that ultimately needed police intervention.
The story is told that when Jiddische Arbeiters were asked how Jew could fight Jew, they answered, "Those aren't Jews, they're fascists." Anti-Zionism, or non-Zionism of the sort espoused by the Reverend Bender in Cape Town, was more about acculturation than true assimilation. Ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionism of the type espoused originally by Agudas Yisrael has never really manifested itself in South Africa, and the inclusion of a prayer for the State of Israel into synagogue services after the founding of the state indicates how most of the rabbinate were enthusiastic supporters of Zionism. Since the Reform movement was a comparative latecomer to South Africa, the pro- and anti-factions in progressive Judaism had already resolved their differences, and the Reform rabbis who served their community here were equally supportive.
Another of the dominant community institutions of South Africa, and allied significantly with the Zionist movement, was the emergence of the Jewish youth movements of South Africa. Their inspiration can be traced back to the emergence of similar groups and societies in Europe and the UK concerned with the physical well-being and improvement of young people, such as the Scouting movement in Britain and the Wandervögel in Germany.
In many instances, those movements were restrictive of membership or openly anti-Semitic, so Jewish equivalents were started. The first and strongest of the uniformed youth movements was Habonim, the Builders. Founded by Norman Lurie in 1930
and modelled on the English movement that began in 1929. The founding principles were more general and concerned with self-development as a rounded Jew, though the Zionist side was there from the start, but worded more vaguely than the political alignments that emerged later. In fact, Habonim remained independent of direct connection to an Israeli political faction for most of its existence, while progressively evolving its socialist-inclined principles and commitment to chalutziyut, or pioneering.
The South African Jewish community was strong enough to sustain an entire spectrum of ideological inclination amongst the youth movements. Hashomer HaTzair had begun in Eastern Europe in Galicia and was initially both Marxist and Zionist. It first emerged in South Africa in 1936, placing a strong emphasis on pioneering and labor.
Religious Zionism found its youth expression in Bnei Akiva, where a strong adherence to religious orthodoxy, combined with a wide variety of social activities, made it particularly appealing for those who were more conservatively inclined but still sought the comradeship of the youth movements without a dominant political overtone.
Beitar was directly linked to the revisionist movement of Jabotinsky and, after the founding of the State of Israel, to the Herut Party. Of all the South African youth movements, it remained resolutely independent for ideological reasons and outside of the Zionist Federation and its Youth Council for most of its existence. The reform or progressive movement in South Africa eventually formed its own youth group, initially as Maginim, and now part of the international youth movement Netzer, whose name they have adopted. All of these groups had a strong and vibrant presence within the South African community. At their peak in the late 60s, approximately 40% of South African Jewish youth were affiliated to one or another of these groups. Hashomer HaTzair and Habonim stand out for their Zionist pioneering connection in establishing, in the 40s, training farms to prepare those making aliyah for life on a kibbutz in Israel. These were the source of much amusement and bemusement for the Afrikaner farmers in the nearby region who could not grasp farming activity without a black labor force.
Wherever one goes in most of South Africa, one can find reminders of a South African Jewish presence. From arrival to the search for parnassa, a livelihood, to the establishment of a presence in community institutions and bricks and mortar, if you know where to look, you can see that we were and are here. But perhaps none is as subtle and overlooked as this, a comparatively recent arrival. It's the sign of the Eruv, the symbolic wall and gateway that indicates the definition of an urban Jewish presence.
One day I looked up and there you were, like a simple question What